Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 15 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. You better take a chill pill, because chapter 15 is called Hell Freezes Over. I bet you'll love it. Some said there was no way the Eagles would ever reunite. Well, they were wrong. For the first time in 14 years, the Eagles finally got back together in 1994. Here we go. Don Henley was flying high. He released his second solo album, Building the Perfect Beast, in 1984, and had his greatest success to date with his single, The Boys of Summer, an editorial on the failed dreams of the 60s. The video of the single won the MTV Award for Best Video of the Year, and within 12 months, he had also won a Grammy for Best Male Rock Vocal Performance. In 1985, he was watching Late Night with David Letterman when he saw Glenn interviewed and singing Desperado. He called him after the show for a chat, the first time they had spoken in 5 years. Irving, ever hopeful, heard of their contact and organized a dinner for the three of them that Christmas in Aspen, but no Eagles reunion was forthcoming. Glenn went on to have some success with the song The Heat Is On, written by Keith Forsey and Harold Faltermeyer and featured in the film Beverly Hills Cop, starring Eddie Murphy. Glenn also starred in an episode of Miami Vice, thus fulfilling a lifelong dream of becoming an actor. Further roles followed, including one as a plumber turned commando in a film called Let's Get Harry, but a television show he starred in made network history by being canceled after just one episode. Few other acting jobs were forthcoming, and he ended up in television commercials promoting a fitness chain. I spent a few years working with the Bee's G's producer, an innovative genius named Albie Galutin. He and I had first met in Miami during the recording of Hotel California when I had been asked to play on a couple of their albums. I liked the Gibb brothers immensely. Barry especially was the perfect English gentleman. Ever since my days in the Monty Quintet, I'd been a sucker for all things British, and Barry Gibb reminded me of Graham Nash. Albie and I set up in business together, developing some technical equipment and working with some great musicians. We had a lot of fun. My nickname for him was, I'll be seeing ya. After a few years' successful collaboration, he went off and did his own thing, concentrating on the technical side, leaving me wondering what to do next. By 1986, things had changed. Don was still reeling emotionally from the breakup of the Eagles, an event he later said that took him 8 years to recover from. Joe Walsh was opening for Tina Turner, getting divorced and struggling with drugs and alcohol. Rehab beckoned. Timothy Smith was making solo records and working as a session player with people like Richard Marx, Bob Seger, Jimmy Buffett, and Greg Allman. The world largely forgot Randy Meisner and Bernie Leadon, despite their individual successes and diverse solo projects. Only in Japan, where a Best of the Eagles album had been released in 1985 by WEA, were we still riding high in the charts. I shelved plans for a second solo album and concentrated on my real estate ventures and spending time with my family. I learned how to fly a plane, an interest sparked from years of visiting cockpits of the planes we toured in and being allowed to take the controls, and got my commercial rating. I did some sea bass fishing in the kelp beds off Malibu with Cheech Marin, Jimmy Pankow, and my good friend Jack Pritchett, the realtor who had found us our first house in Malibu. On one trip out into a choppy ocean, a freak wave hit my little 17-foot boat and almost capsized us. We somehow escaped with just cuts and bruises, despite being tossed up into the air like something out of the perfect storm. I remember clinging to the side of the boat, half drowned and praying for a speedy deliverance. Afterward, Cheech joked, "Hey man, I can just see the headlines if we hadn't made it. Don Felder of the Eagles, Cheech Marin of Cheech and Chong, Jimmy Pankow of Chicago, all drowned in a tragic boating accident, with an unidentified male. He had wetsuit jackets made up for each of us with our names embroidered on them. Jack's read, unidentified. It wasn't the first time I had nearly drowned. besides a couple of surfing accidents that left me with lifelong back problems and a few gallons of the Pacific in my lungs. Joe and I once took his boat, the So What, to Santa Cruz Island when a storm blew in. Stupidly high on blow and Jack Daniels with an inexperienced young captain, we left the sanctuary of Smuggler's Cove and headed back out across the ocean, because we were due to leave for a European tour the following morning. The Coast Guard had strongly advised us against attempting the crossing and followed us in their cutter as the waves pitched and tossed us like corks. "Here, put this on," Joe told me, handing me a plastic garbage bag and some gaffer tape. He hadn't thought to stow foul-weather gear. So there we stood, wrapped up in black plastic bags, swigging brandy, trying to see through the wall of water that was crashing onto our little boat at regular intervals. We made it by the skin of our teeth, and only when we arrived in the port did we notice the Coast Guard helicopter hovering overhead. "Is that there for our benefit?" we asked the Coast Guard radio operator gratefully. "No," he growled. "We took photographs of you for training purposes." "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah, we're gonna use you as an example of how stupid some people in boats can be." The Malibu incidents frightened the life out of me, so I bought a bigger boat, a 25-foot Sea Ray for weekend trips out to Catalina and the islands with the kids for swimming, spearfishing, and snorkeling. Excursions that I think were probably the happiest days of their lives. Even the Sea Ray wasn't quite up to those rolling Pacific waves, so we upgraded to a 42-foot Grand Banks, which we called Nantucket, after the place where Susan and I spent our honeymoon. I busied myself with other stuff, too. I became a scuba diver to master level, and I won the Catalina Island Lobster Contest for catching the biggest lobster on opening day. I learned Spanish from my gap-toothed gardener, inadvertently ending up speaking like the Mexican equivalent of Gabby Hayes, and I spent a lot of time playing golf, for pleasure and for charity, with friends like Peter Satura. I built Susan a potter studio at the back of our house, and learned how to throw some half-decent pots and vases myself, after she and Cheech taught me, but mainly I was bored and depressed. My relationship with Susan at that time didn't help. She had had a serious health scare soon after Leah was born. She needed surgery on one that ended up being diagnosed as a benign nodule on her thyroid. I bought her a beautiful gold and diamond necklace to hide the scar on her throat. Unfortunately, the problems with her thyroid affected her behavior for a while, and she lost some of the verbs she had always had. Our therapy sessions became ever more intensive, and it seemed to me that the more time we spent talking to a third party about our problems, the less we actually talked to each other. The thought of what was happening in my marriage and my life dragged me to an all-time low. I gained 20 pounds as I tried to reconcile myself to being a husband, a dad, and a retired rocker. The hundreds of people who had been part of the Eagles machine, whom I thought of as my friends, had evaporated. For a while there, I felt pretty lost, a 37-year-old has-been. By comparison to Don's career, mine had come to a grinding halt. Most of all, I missed playing and performing music more than I could ever have imagined, even during the darkest days. There's something so emotionally fulfilling in standing on stage and playing live music to an audience. Nothing beats it, and without a regular fix, I felt bereft. Ultimately, the Eagles proved to be the best any of us would ever do. The combination of our various talents and the creative tension that had fueled them was a heady mix that none of us would ever thought would match individually. Don came pretty close with his hits and videos, but didn't quite reach the same magnitude. Everyone's desire was to work together again, but at the time, it was still impossible. We'd gone off in different directions, and had limits to how much we'd be willing to tolerate again. After a year of feeling sorry for myself, our therapist suggested that I go on Prozac. "I think it might just help you get through this rough patch," she advised. "Okay," I smiled. "I've done drugs before. Give me some." Fortunately, Susan's condition stabilized, and she was eventually able to pick herself up and start all over again. I began to feel much like the old Fingers Felder, so I flushed my pills down the toilet. Every few months or so, some spark would be lit about the possibility of an Eagles reunion, and Irving would call up, "Hey Don, how you doing? I'm just checking in. Still hoping to get the guys together in the same room sometime. If it comes off, are you in?" "Book it, Irving," I'd always say. After months of nothing ever coming of it, though, I decided to try something myself. Tired of fishing, sailing, and renovating houses, I told Irving, if the Eagles aren't going to work together again, then let's put something together with those of us who will. Irving seemed nervous at first. I don't think he was sure where a band consisting of 2/5 of the Eagles would fit in. Timothy jumped at the chance. I'm in, he said. We both contacted Joe, and he agreed to join us. We didn't have a name or much of an idea of what we could do, but we knew we needed a singer, so Walsh suggested an English guy who had a really great soulful rock and roll voice, Terry Reid. His greatest claim to fame was that he had almost been the lead singer with Led Zeppelin, turning the job down for a solo career before recommending the unknown Robert Plant to Jimmy Page. He had worked with Cream, Procol Harum, and the Yardbirds, and he had supported the Rolling Stones, the Hollies, the Faces, and Jefferson Airplane. He knew David Lindley, Graham Nash, and Jackson Browne, and had done some session work for Don Henley. He was a couple of years younger than me, and his pedigree was excellent. The trouble was that both he and Joe liked to drink, and I quickly realized that we couldn't work with either of them. Joe was pretty bad by then. He couldn't even drive himself anywhere or walk the streets alone. He was so incapable of dealing with the real world due to the paranoia caused by his addiction to drugs and alcohol that he had to be accompanied everywhere by his personal bodyguard, a supposed former White House Secret Service agent called Smokey. Matters came to a head at a meeting with Irving when we were discussing a measly $500,000 record budget, which by the time we had paid the studios and the cartage and the road crew amounted to around $40,000 each. Joe had known Irving since they were in college together. They had been roommates in Illinois. Enraged, he jumped to his feet and leaped at him, screaming, "You're just trying to us over, aren't you?" Joe was blue in the face from rage. He stormed out of the office in disgust. Irving was incandescent with anger. "Did you see that lunatic? He's so unstable. There's no way he's ever going to be in this band." I was shocked. I'd never seen Joe so angry, not even when we were destroying hotel rooms with chainsaws. The last time I'd seen anyone treat Irving like that was when the mild-mannered Jimmy Pankow lost it with him in a hotel room in Honolulu in the late 70s during the Long Run tour. Realizing after this incident that our new band wouldn't work with either Joe or Terry Reid, Timothy and I scouted around for another singer. We tried a couple, including Paul Carrick, another Englishman, a singer-songwriter who had been involved with Nick Lau and the bands Ace, Mike plus the Mechanics, and Squeeze. I wanted one other singer who could play and write, and we eventually settled on Paul and another great guy named Max Carl from his bands 38 Special and Big Dance. Now that we had our lineup, we recorded 6 or 8 songs together, including a great track written by Paul with Jim Capaldi and Peter Vale called Love Will Keep Us Alive. It was a joy for Timothy and me to work with these guys compared to some of the experiences in recent years. Based in my little studio in Malibu, we laughed and had a good time and played really well together. We put the songs we'd completed on a demo and took them to Irving, who jumped up and down with excitement. "Hey, Fingers, these are really good," he said with obvious surprise. "I think you might have something here. What's the band called?" We toyed with a couple of names like Big Sky or Big Party, but nothing seemed to fit. We couldn't think of anything to really work, so we gave ourselves a temporary name, Malibu Men's Choir, I told Irving. Seeing the expression on his face, I added, "Not really, Irv. We just made that up for a laugh. We'll come up with something else, don't worry." A week later, a fax came rolling off my machine at home. There was no preparatory phone call, no attempt at a proper explanation, just 2 sentences from Irving's office. "We will not be entering into a recording contract with the Malibu Men's Choir. We thank you for your input, but the material you submitted wasn't strong enough." I felt sick to my stomach. Still hopeful of an Eagles reunion, Irving set up more talks after he had heard that Don and Glenn had spent a rare evening together at the Carlisle Hotel in New York, drinking crystal champagne and reminiscing. In the summer of 1989, Don produced a stunning third album, The End of Innocence, which went on to sell over 6 million copies and swept the Grammy Awards. I sent him a bottle of champagne and a telegram that said, "Congratulations on your broad sweep of the music industry. Attaboy, Guano." His response was both warm and humble. Although I sometimes found him too obsessive and critical, he always had the capacity to be charming when he wanted to be, and he and I had never really had a problem. The following year, Irving again broached the subject of what he called a possible resumption tour. The reactions from Don and Glenn were finally favorable, and the rest of us agreed. As before, my response was unequivocal. Book it, Irv. In November, Irving called to tell me, "We're on," and gave me details of where I had to be and when. I was more than a little anxious at seeing Glenn again for the first time in 10 years, but I figured that if he agreed to the reunion, then he must have put our spat at Long Beach behind him. I arrived at a little rehearsal hall in North Hollywood next to Burbank Airport called the Third Encore, named in fond memory of our legendary tour parties by the guy who owned it, who had been on the road with us as a keyboard tech and was soon given the nickname Norton. Don had hired Danny Korchmar to produce our new project. Danny was a guitarist and songwriter turned producer who knew Don from the Troubadour days and who had also worked with Glenn. Danny had co-produced all of Don's solo albums, and Don wanted him on board now. Glenn's suggestion had been Elliot Snyder, who had produced his solo records, but Don didn't rate him as high. Our old friend Bill Seismic was semi-retired and had been out of the loop for a while, and the gods decided that he wasn't up to the job. A guitar player Don sometimes worked with named Frank Symes showed up, and Joe was due any moment. We had no idea when Glenn would show his face. Days passed, and there was still no sign of Joe or Glenn. So we puttered around setting everything up, and we waited. Joe was pretty intoxicated most of the time by then and kept sending excuses. Glenn was supposed to fly in from Aspen any day with 2 or 3 songs he'd written, but he never showed. He supposedly sent a message through Irving instead saying that he had his songs already written and would meet us in the studio. We carried on, rehearsing a couple of numbers Don was going to sing, and one great ballad called People Can Change, which Don wrote for Timothy to sing. We all believed it was aimed at Glenn. Let's hope people can change, I told Don. It'd be great if that could be the theme of this whole resumption. He nodded and smiled. We played with the tracks and worked out a couple licks, but there was still no sign of Joe or Glenn. After a few more days of waiting, we booked the A&M studio at La Sindinga and La Brea in Hollywood. Irving told us that Glenn had said he wouldn't be there the first day and would come later. Okay, we thought, at least we don't have to go through the hair-pulling writing stage. Don has a couple things. There's something for Timothy to sing, Glenn has a couple songs, and we were certain Joe would bring in a song or two. We're good, we told each other, not really believing it. This'll be easy. We spent the first couple days in the studio setting up the drums, bass, and guitar so that they didn't buzz or hum and sounded just right. It takes a while to get comfortable in a new studio, and we were still waiting. When Joe hadn't showed up on the second day, we put a call to his house. His English roadie answered, "Joe was up really late working on something last night, and he can't come in today, but he'll be there tomorrow by 2, he said. The next day we were all there at 1 o'clock, hoping for the best. 2 o'clock came and went, and there was no Joe. Then 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. We finally called the roadie, and he said, "Oh yeah, Joe's just getting out of the shower now. He'll be down in an hour." By 6 o'clock we called again, and were told that Joe was so tired he had gone back to sleep. On the 4th day, Joe finally showed up, reeking, and carrying a little black shoulder bag clutched to his side, which he took into the bathroom frequently. It was uncertain exactly what the poison of the day was. Probably copious amounts of Jack Daniels or gin combined with cocaine, but his breath could probably have propelled a small aircraft. We were heavily disappointed that he was in such a state of disrepair, but late in the morning, when he was so inebriated that I thought he'd fall off a stool, he plugged in his amp for his Layla-type guitar solo on one of the tracks and played one of the meanest licks I had ever heard. Okay, we said, looking at each other in surprise. Joe can still play. Cool. This could really work. Over the next day or two, we started recording tracks that Don would sing, convincing ourselves that Glenn would come in later and play his guitar and add whatever he felt he needed. He kept putting us off until finally Irving arrived, stone-faced. "Glenn's not coming to the party," he said, his dismay evident. "He's decided not to do it. It's over." For a split second, I wondered if Glenn had ever really agreed to do this in the first place, or whether Irving had been yanking our chains. Maybe he thought that if he told us Glenn would do it and we all got together and started, that Glenn would actually agree. Whatever his plan, it wasn't going to work. We looked at each other and shook our heads in disbelief. Someone said, "Well, if he doesn't want to do it, let's just go ahead without him." No one really wanted to do that. Our hearts weren't in it, especially not after my failed attempt with Timothy and Joe. If it wasn't all of us, it wouldn't be the Eagles. Maybe Glenn was right. Maybe he was the leader of the band after all. None of us felt like we should do it without him. Don summed it up. Without Glenn on board, it would just be like Don Henley and his backing band. Glenn threatened to go to the press and say we weren't the Eagles without him. He said he'd even file a lawsuit to stop us from going ahead. He issued a series of increasingly angry statements, enough for us to say, okay, maybe we really shouldn't do it. The saddest thing is that we had some great songs. One was by Frank Symes, on which Joe and I had a rockin' guitar track. It was an outline for a song, sort of a ZZ Top straight-up rock and roll number. It would have been fun, but we had to shelve the whole project. I guess those songs will be lost forever now. All I had to remember the experience by is a short videotape of those who showed up, fooling around in the studio, having fun, and hoping for the best. I had wanted it to record a little bit of music history, the regrouping of a great band. Instead, it became its video epitaph. I filed it away on a shelf and called it Almost the Eagles. Being rich and famous is fantastic. You get to live in a fabulous house, drive fancy cars, own boats, take great vacations, and buy yourself or your loved ones whatever you like. Trust me, it's worth all the effort it takes to get there, especially when you happen to be anonymous. Because of my reclusive tag, I had never been easily recognized, not like a movie star. I had been out socially with friends whose faces are far better known, and they all get stopped on the sidewalk or approached in restaurants and asked for their autographs while I sit there silently, smiling to myself and thanking the Lord that nobody knows who I am. The minute someone discovers my connection with the Eagles, their attitude changes instantly. From being vaguely polite and interested, they suddenly become my new best friend. Everyone seems to have a daughter or a brother or a cousin who wants to make it in the music business and has a CD they want me to hear. More often than not, I do listen to them, because you never know when the next John Mayer or Beyonce is going to pop up. I don't mind using my celebrity status to help people along the way, to win some extra influence to a charity event, or to further someone else's cause. But in modern-day America, there is another more sinister element to celebrity that has to be considered, even for those of us who are anonymous: personal safety. By just living in a particular area or being in this industry, you can inadvertently lay yourself open to those who begrudge you or feel they own a part of you. When we were on the road, we were always being asked to sign autographs. Young women would scream at stage doors to take the pen they offered and write your name across their breasts. Hopeful young guitar players would hold up their tattered Stratocasters or their personal copies of Hotel California and ask the same. I never minded signing whatever they wanted me to, and I never once knowingly refused an autograph to a genuine fan. More often than not, however, people at the door were professional autograph hunters, people who made a great deal of money by selling signed memorabilia to Eagles fans. The professionals were usually pretty easy to spot. They carried stacks of LPs instead of just one, or they had 4 guitars at their feet. They could get a lot of money for an Eagles black and white photo with all of our signatures on it, and thousands for a guitar. Without my name added to the others in ink, the same item was only worth about $50. We learned how to spot them by asking, "What's your name?" A genuine fan always wants the record, photograph, or t-shirt signed to themselves, and I'll duly write, "To Marcy, with love, Don Felder." Autographs are worth far less when they're signed to a person, and the professionals jump down your throat if you try it. "No, man, don't write anything. Just sign your name." After that, they'd get one signature from me, and I'd move on to find a genuine fan. To professional autograph hunters, I had been a pain in the ass. For no reason other than where and how I lived, I was often not with the other Eagles when it came to collecting signatures. They might have all the other guys' names on a stack of LPs or guitars, but not mine. When the band split up in 1980, the price for Eagles memorabilia skyrocketed. Likewise, when someone dies, their back catalog suddenly becomes worth so much more. Without all 5 signatures on their precious cachet of goods, their haul was almost worthless. I was well accustomed to people contacting me through the record company in Irving's office, asking me to sign something for them. If I felt they were true fans, I'd always invite them to send me their LP or whatever, and I'd gladly sign it and send it back. I was happy to. If not for our devoted fans, we'd be nothing, and I have always been grateful for their support. When Almost the Eagles happened, the venue was meant to be a secret because nobody wanted the press or anyone to know in case it ended as it did. Word somehow got out, however, and on the second day there was suddenly a barrage of professional autograph hunters at the door of the third encore. It still astounds me how thorough people are at getting information from those who rent rehearsal halls, drive limousines, or deliver cable or beverages to somewhere like that. They know more than I did, where it was taking place and what time we'd be coming and going. There were dozens of fans waiting to pounce. Once again, I tried to find the genuine article among the professionals, although I think most of them went away happy. When that project sadly ended and I returned to my home and my privacy, I suddenly became unavailable again. Most autograph hunters accepted that and approached me for signatures through their usual channels. One, however, was more determined. I began to receive letters from him at my house in Malibu, begging me to sign all his stuff. He must have run a title search for my name on all the property I owned and driven out to the various addresses until he figured out which one I lived in. A little unnerving, to say the least. At first he was extremely polite. "Dear Mr. Felder, I'm a huge Eagles fan and I have a massive collection of memorabilia signed by everyone but you. I'd be honored if you'd meet me somewhere to sign it. Thank you." I wrote him back via Irving's office telling him, "Thanks for your letter. I'm sure you understand that I wouldn't feel comfortable arranging a meeting with a complete stranger, especially not after you contacted me directly. But if you want to send me a bunch of your stuff, I'll gladly sign them and send them back." His response was angry. "That wouldn't be acceptable," he wrote. "There's too much, and anyway, these things are very precious to me, and I'd be afraid I wouldn't get them back. We have to meet, face to face." In 6 or 7 exchanges that followed, my same calm response was followed by his angry reply. Our home in Malibu sat on 6 acres and was surrounded by a 6-foot-high chain-link fence and specially planted prickly privacy hedge. I had 2 Labradors and a German Shepherd named Emma, who had been trained as an attack dog. I acquired her after another incident a few years earlier when a complete stranger wearing odd clothes and with straggly hair suddenly appeared at the French windows of our house. I don't even know how he got in, but he asked me where a wedding was and placed 3 caliber bullets in my hands with the words, "These will protect you." I ran inside, locked the doors, and dialed 911. As I did so, I saw Susan coming up the garden path right behind him. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Get off my property!" she shrieked, waving her arms at him. The kids were just a few hundred yards away in the pool when he raced back down the driveway looking spooked. I ran out and pulled Susan and the kids inside and told the police to get to my house urgently. We watched from the window as the guy went down to his car, which was inexplicably parked in our drive, and opened the trunk. I honestly thought he was going to get a gun out and come back up to the house to kill us all. I didn't even have a weapon on the property, and all I could think of to do was grab a kitchen knife. As we watched, he stripped off all his clothes and put on a woman's dress. I had visions of him in a horror movie coming up and massacring us all wearing this dress. Instead, he took some more bullets out of his pocket, threw them around on the ground like he was blessing us with them, got into his car, drove to the gate, and disappeared. The police eventually picked him up in my neighbor's garden. He was from an insane asylum in Carmelo. Somehow he had escaped his guards and gotten hold of a gun and some ammunition. The officers told us we had had a very lucky escape. He was arrested while in the process of trying to convince a lady who lived down the street to look at something in the trunk of his car. She said she thought he was going to shove her in the trunk and take off. That incident really spooked me. Susan and the kids were my chief concern, so I bought a .357 Magnum pistol, and she and I took shooting lessons at a local range. I updated my security and bought Emma. The Labradors, which I had owned for years, had just thumped their tails in greeting at the lunatic. By the time I began to receive this stream of letters from the determined autograph hunter, I was pretty happy with my security. That was until one November day in 1993 when I was out in the yard, working on the '57 Chevy pickup truck I had bought in memory of my dad, into which I was fitting a Corvette engine. I was in old jeans and a sweatshirt, covered in grease from my fingers to my elbow, having a private journey down memory lane back to Gainesville, and my father working under the hood of his old Chevy while I passed him some tools. "Hey, Dad," I said to myself, "are you watching me now? Are you impressed?" I was awoken from my reverie by a rustling in the bushes. "Hey, Don!" I suddenly heard. "Don Felder! Over here!" Looking up, I could see a man leaning over my fence in a 6-foot hedge, waving something at me. "Hey, Don, I've got some of those albums I want you to sign. Over here." Wondering where on earth the German Shepherd was when I needed her, I stared at this guy in total disbelief before striding purposely into the house. Emma came as soon as I whistled and stood there growling at the intruder while I grabbed the phone. I had heard of not taking no for an answer, but this was extreme. First he'd found out where I lived, and then when he refused my offer to send his stuff to me, he came to my house to confront me. "Holy!" I yelled angrily, throwing down a wrench. "Who the does this guy think he is?" I didn't mind signing anything for him, but after the experience with the psycho, this was too bizarre. I dialed 911 and asked the police to come right away. "There's a man trespassing on my property," I told the sheriff as I locked all the doors. "I'd like him removed at once." The police arrived and picked him up. They drove him several blocks away and warned him if he were ever caught harassing me on my own property again, they'd arrest him. I hoped that it would be enough. A couple weeks later, just a few days before Christmas, my realtor friend Jack Pritchett called me up. "Hey, how you doing?" I asked. "Want to do some fishing this week?" "Yeah, maybe," came the distracted reply. "Listen, Don, I've just driven past your house down the Pacific Coast Highway, and I saw something really strange. I had to stop the car and turn around to make sure I was seeing it right." "What? Seeing what right?" I asked. "Well, there's this guy dressed as Santa Claus standing out on the street holding up a giant placard." "Yeah, and?" "The placard says, 'Don Felder is unfair to his fans. He won't sign autographs.' I'm the strongest advocate of free speech, but Psycho Santa, as he will forever be known in our house, was behaving so strangely that I called the police again. The sheriff found him and issued another warning, but he was too far from my house to be arrested for harassment. I felt really bad about calling the cops. I didn't want to see the guy in prison. I just wanted him to accept my offer to sign his stuff and leave me and my family alone. A couple weeks after Christmas, I received a videotape in the mail. It was from Psycho Santa. In it, he gave me a guided tour of his bedroom, which was set up as a shrine to the Eagles. It was too weird. His voice was close to the mic, narrating where he'd acquired which item and why. He slowly panned around the room, showing me his stash of t-shirts, albums, posters, football jerseys, and guitars, all set up in a very obsessive way. Anyone can be a fan, but this was way beyond the norm. He was almost salivating over the memorabilia he slept with every night, and his breathless narration made my flesh crawl. He was scaring my wife, my kids, and me. I sent the tape to my attorney and had a restraining order issued for him. He had given me no other choice. "Please, Lord, may we no longer hear from him again," I said to Susan, and for a long time, we didn't. One night in 1993, I was at home flicking through the TV channels absent-mindedly when I suddenly spotted Don and Glenn on stage performing at a charity event without Timothy and me. They were playing Hotel California. I was staggered. No one had ever approached me or even told me about it. I felt like a spouse betrayed. This was the second time I knew of when other members of the band had played together after the split. Don had done a benefit concert in Massachusetts for the Walden Woods Project, a pet campaign of his to preserve from developers the Massachusetts land that inspired the writer Henry David Thoreau. I had a horrible, sinking feeling that events I knew nothing about were happening without me. I found out later that Glenn and Joe had decided to do the latest gig together as part of their Party of Two tour, and Irving, still hopeful, had invited Don to sit in. It was on Glenn's home turf, and as there wasn't the pressure of walking into a studio and facing all of us, he still felt like he was in control. A few other gigs followed, and I'd received messages from friends all over the states about it. "Hey, Don," they'd write, "I see the Eagles are doing a gig in Portland, Oregon. Any chance of some tickets?" It would be the first I'd known of any gigs, and when I made inquiries, I'd discover it was just Glenn and Joe playing together. There was another gig in Central Park for the Democratic campaign with Don, Glenn, Timothy, and a backup band, and there were a couple for the Rainforest Foundation. Only once was I invited to join in for some anti-nuclear gig of Long Beach with Timothy and Don and Lindsey Buckingham of Fleetwood Mac. Glenn was supposed to participate, but never did. Instead, he sent an apologetic video from his hospital bed where he was recovering from stomach surgery saying, "Hey guys, I'd love to be there with you, but as you can see, I'm tied up here for a while." I sent him a bouquet of flowers and wished him well, but never heard a word back. When I asked Irving why I hadn't been asked to any of the other gigs, he told me, Don't worry about it, Felder. It was hard enough to get those guys to work together. You were omitted so that there wouldn't be that specific friction between you and Glenn that would make him refuse to do it. I thought that if we started this way, it would be easier to include you later. I felt sick to my stomach. I wondered how much it really was a ploy to get Glenn to play ball, or whether Irving was saying, "Fingers, we can do this without you." Glenn and I still hadn't spoken since the Alan Cranston incident 13 years before, although I had tried half a dozen times to extend olive branches. When Glenn divorced his first wife after just 3 years of marriage, I sent him a note expressing my sorrow and asking if there was anything I could do. As with the flowers, I never received a reply. It was all very strange, because I could never recall doing anything to Glenn that warranted his behavior. I never screwed his wife behind his back or stole anything from him. I had just become a scapegoat for the breakup of the band and the ongoing sibling rivalry between him and Don, because I dared to vent some feelings publicly, as Glenn so freely and frequently did, and because I had occasionally asked some searching questions about the way the band was being run. I can even remember being in a little studio in L.A. with Glenn one night after we recorded Those Shoes for the long run, when he told me that what I'd brought to the band would propel it to a whole new level of success. "Man, what you've added to our sound with Hotel California, and all the musical changes you've made is awesome," he said. "I knew when I first heard you play, Sly, that you were perfect for this band, and you really are one of the main reasons the Eagles have risen to this level." I was staggered. It was so unlike Glenn to give credit to anyone. I will never forget that night, sitting there after everyone left, snorting some cocaine together, while he expressed his sincere appreciation of me and acknowledged what I'd done. How could it have gone so wrong? Or was it just the drugs talking? Later, in 1993, Irving Azoff rounded up some of America's biggest country stars in Nashville and issued an album of covers of Eagles songs. It was called Common Thread, the songs of the Eagles, and features stars such as Alan Jackson, Travis Tritt, Trisha Yearwood, Brooks and Dunn, and Clint Black. Irving had resigned from MCA and had set up Giant Records. Don Henley, one of his first new clients after splitting from David Geffen again, was intimately involved in the Nashville project, and a portion of the proceeds of the album sales were to go to the Walden Woods Project. Common Thread was like the remake of a favorite old movie, and it sounded great. After years and years of hearing those songs sung in the same old way without a single note altered, it was good to hear fresh voices with a new take. I was impressed. The album sold 3 million copies in its first 6 months and rose to number 1 on the country chart and number 3 on the pop chart. It was even named Album of the Year by the Country Music Association. The first single was Take It Easy, written by Glenn and Jackson Brown, sung by Travis Tritt. To promote the single, Travis wanted to come up with something really different, an eye-catching video to be released for Christmas 1993. He suddenly suggested getting the Eagles back together again. When everyone stopped laughing, someone said, "Why not?" The record company asked Don first and then the rest of us, and amazingly, Glenn agreed. The original idea of the shoot was that Travis would be singing in a seedy bar in downtown L.A., and we'd be his backup band, shooting pool and hanging around behind him. There was to be a couple shots of all of us arriving and leaving the bar together. The filming was all very secretive. Streets were blocked off and everyone was sworn to silence. A funky Spanish-looking bar in North Hollywood was selected, and for the first time in 13 years, we were all going to be in the same room together. There had been a lot of nervous anticipation in the days leading up to it, and when we arrived for the shoot, I felt the way I had on my first day of high school in Gainesville, watching all the other kids arrive in their parents' cars wearing brand new clothes. Fortunately, Joe was there early, and he and I fooled around, and he made me laugh, instantly diffusing an extremely tense situation. When Glenn arrived, we said hello politely and then hugged. "Good to see you, man," I told him. "Yeah," he said, "it's good to be here." The atmosphere worsened, though, when everyone arrived except Don. We knew of old that he was always late, but the 45 minutes he made us wait that day seemed like 145. Was he coming? Or was he going to piss Glenn off by not showing, as Glenn had in 1990? By the time Don eventually walked through the door, I felt so brittle I could have snapped in two. They said hello and hugged each other and began rehearsing Desperado almost right away, a song for which Joe and I weren't required. In urgent need of some light relief, the two of us did something we used to do in the old days, which was sit at the back, not mic'd up, and look as if we were singing harmonies, when actually we were singing Desert Rat Hole, Avocado, or El Dorado, anything but Desperado. It had started as a childish way of keeping ourselves entertained and awake during the long periods in an Eagles set when only ballads would be played, but it helped break the tension of that sizzling day. Within a few hours, though, we were shooting pool together, jamming, and actually having fun. It was like a high school band getting back together for a 20-year reunion and playing Louie Louie. There was even a mock-up of us lined up against the wall outside the bar, being arrested by a highway patrolman, which brought back some old memories of a few close calls. It felt good to be back together and making music again. Glenn and I spoke to each other quite cordially and even hugged again at the end. We should do this more often, I told him, trying to resume my old diplomatic role in the band as a sort of marriage counselor between the warring factions. Yeah, he nodded, we should. The planets were aligning. The video was a great success and sparked what one leading rock journalist described as Eagle Mania. The ever-resourceful Irving attempted yet another reunion. After the Northridge earthquake destroyed Don's L.A. home and he decided to return to his native Texas, Irving quickly organized another lunch in Aspen, to which Don, Glenn, and Joe were invited. Timothy and I weren't. The numbers being thrown around this time for a resumption tour were too tempting for any of them to refuse. The Eagles had never originally been about making music for money, but suddenly it became the main focus of interest. Irving called everyone, conducting a litmus test to see how we felt. Word came back that if the money was right, there might be a possibility. It's amazing how a few zeros on the end of a check can make you forget about how much you dislike someone and justify you putting up with them again after all these years. After more than a decade of silence and inactivity, everyone agreed to try again, to rehabilitate, get back into shape, relearn old skills, and put away our differences. Glenn had first come up with the word resumption. We weren't reuniting, he insisted, just resuming. We honestly didn't know if we could pull it off, and nobody knew how long it would hold together if we did. 6 months was the initial estimate, but $300 million sure can put a smile on a person's face. The resumption tour was on. Irving faxed the media a 4-word message to announce the news. It said simply, "Hell has frozen over." Well, that's the end of Chapter 15. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 15 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.